Dear colleagues, dear guests, I'm happy to welcome you here. I'm sorry that we had this little delay, and we also have just some housekeeping issues, some last time changes in the list of our panelists. So I hope it still will be a perfect panel and a very interesting discussion. My name is Maria Rybko. I'm Deputy Director of the Center for Economic Strategy, and our today's event is prepared in the collaboration with the International Center for Ukrainian Victory and with the Kiev Independent Insights. Today you joined the frozen Russian assets, how to confiscate in favor of Ukraine. And we have this event in parallel online and offline. So this is a hybrid format. I encourage all of you who are listening to us online to ask your questions, to participate actively in the Q&A session, and my colleagues will send it to me to WhatsApp, so I will be able to ask our esteemed panelists these questions. Today we are honored by several very important persons. I will make an introduction now and then explain how this all will be happening. So today we have Addar Levi, Principal Deputy General Counsel at the US Department of Treasury. She's joining us online. And Andrii Mikheiev, International Law and Anti-Corruption expert at the International Center for Ukrainian Victory. And both of them are our today's keynote speakers. So I would ask them to give their speeches first. Then I will introduce our panel, and we will be able to go to the discussion with the audience and to the Q&A from our web listeners. So today's topic is actually following one very important development for Ukraine, the decision of the G7 Leaders Committee on providing Ukraine with the $50 billion of proceeds from the Russian assets. I will now read a bit from the communique of G7 leaders. So what do we know from it? We know that there is $50 billion leveraging the extraordinary revenues of the immobilized Russian sovereign assets. And by doing this, they are sending an unmistakable signal to President Putin that we are stepping collectively our efforts to disarm and defund Russia's military-industrial complex. This all will be packed as extraordinary revenue acceleration ERA loans for Ukraine, and they are hoping to make it available for Ukraine by the end of the year. Also, what is important that one of the statements of the communique actually sounds like we confirm, consistent with all applicable laws and our respective legal systems, Russia's sovereign assets in our jurisdictions will remain immobilized until Russia ends its aggression and pays for the damage that it has caused to Ukraine, which actually brings me to the thought that the full confiscation should be discussion should be also brought to the table. The multi-agency donor coordination platform will be also involved in the coordination of the dispersal of the funds, and all these commitments are to be operationalized before the year end. So with this, I end my opening and invite Addar Levi, Principal Deputy General Counsel at the US Department of the Treasury. Please, the floor is yours, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here, and on behalf of Secretary Yellen, I'd like to say thank you for including us in this conversation. This is an important moment. You know, we've spent the past 3 years condemning Russia's egregious violations of international law and their breaches of, among other things, the United Nations Charter and commitments they've entered into in various international treaties. This represents a way for us to act together. And for that reason, we think it's an important step forward, and one that, as the communique says, sends a strong signal to the Kremlin that there is a coalition that is standing behind Ukraine and ready to act. I'll say a few more words about what ERA is ERA is Extraordinary Revenue Accelerator Loans. These are loans that are made by sovereign countries, but are backed by the interest earnings off of the immobilized Russian sovereign assets. In this way, ERA loans allow us to use Russia's assets to extract value from them to advance Ukraine money that it is legally owed by Russia. We believe this will allow us to get a decisive amount of funding. We said $50 billion in the communique now, without acting on the asset principle and at low or no sovereign budgetary cost. That last part is important because it allows us to move more quickly, both in the US and in other jurisdictions that may wish to participate in the loans. I think it's important to note, especially given the title of today's discussion, that our goal with these assets has always been to get as much funding to Ukraine as quickly as possible. From a US government perspective, we recognize that the vast majority of the assets are not in the United States. And for that reason, Secretary Yellen and others in the Biden-Harris administration have spent countless hours of economic diplomacy and collaboration with our European partners to get to a place where we have consensus around an option that we can act on together. Importantly, this step doesn't take other actions off the table, should the coalition decide they'd wish to take those actions together in the future. There are a number of technical details still to work out before the loans can be dispersed, but we do believe this is an important step forward and one that will allow us to provide Ukraine with critically needed support in this calendar year. Let me pause with that, and I look forward to the discussion.
Many thanks for your introduction. And now I want to pass the floor for the second keynote speech to Andrii Mikheiev, international law and anti-corruption expert at the International Center for Ukraine Victory.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to see you all today. I'm very happy to see a lot of familiar faces, which I have seen on other events before. These are the faces of true friends of Ukraine, worrying about its fate, about its survival, and about getting justice in part of getting assets of Russia as an aggressor. Today we came here to decide the impact and consequences of the great decision which was made by our partners, by G7 and by the European Union separately on how to finance Ukrainian defense, on how to finance Ukrainian survival. We're talking about granting a loan of $50 billion and a separate EU decision on making financial contribution to Ukraine from the revenues from the frozen Russian central bank's assets. We're very grateful. I would like to speak on behalf of all the Ukrainians. We're very grateful for this decision. It's completely a breakthrough, but now we have to rethink and reprocess the aftermath of this decision, the real meaning of this decision, and understand what's going on further. So we came here to discuss the question whether it is the end, whether the development of this process is possible, and is it really so much helpful for Ukraine to achieve all the goals which Ukraine is trying to achieve in this war. So the first issue to decide is whether the G7 and the EU decisions on financial help are really a breakthrough in using the Russian frozen assets. Obviously, yes, it's a great breakthrough. We can all remember like 2022 when everybody was just like wiping sweat, when just we're talking about taking out Russian assets. Everybody told it's almost impossible, it's really complicated, it's for years. And as of now, Europe and the American states, they made it possible to generate revenues and even grant loans backed by this. Also, it's great that these states made a way to shift the burden of paying for Ukrainian support from their own taxpayers to Russia, to revenues from Russian assets. And this completely depoliticized this financial help, as currently it doesn't depend on paying taxes, it doesn't depend on electoral attitude, it doesn't cost careers, and it's obvious that such political decisions regarding such help will be taken much easier, and they will be taken much faster. However, we should understand, we are talking not about the assets and the principal, the principal of assets. We're talking about revenues from assets as a back of the loan and the loan itself. The status of these assets hasn't changed. They are still frozen, and the title of ownership is still Russian. But we hope that this is the first major step on dealing with them. Another question is whether this step will help or vice versa, whether it will block the possibility to confiscate Russian sovereign assets in future. It's really an interesting question, and it all depends on the conditions on which each state granting a loan and the European Union in its separate option will make their conditions. But it's like obvious, and it would be very preferable that this would not block confiscation, full confiscation of assets, and after they are confiscated, part of this amount may be easily used to pay back the loan. But it's not only economic, it's also a political issue, so we will see. And the main issue here is whether this step allows to achieve all the goals of Ukraine and its partners. First, let's try to identify these goals. For Ukraine, it's to survive in this war, it's to win in this war, and it is to have the restoration, the reconstruction of the infrastructure and destroyed by the aggressor. It's to have all the victims compensated for their losses, and finally is to get justice. Yes, obviously this money will obviously help Ukraine to survive. Maybe it will even help especially those spent on defense. Maybe they will help Ukraine to win even. But as for the justice and as for the reconstruction, I don't think, honestly, we're talking about that amount of money which would be enough. And it's not about justice at all, because we have a situation when Russia doesn't pay. The motto of our company was make Russia pay, make aggressor pay for its aggression and for all the injuries it made. And as we see now, Russia is not paying because, like, its assets are frozen. It's the revenues from these assets, they do not belong to Russia at all, and they wouldn't have happened unless Russia starts its aggression and at all. And it's very important that Russia compensates, pays reparation, as it is designated by the United Nations. And when Russia financially suffers, at least and compensates for everything it has done. So it's crucially important to pursue the activities on further confiscation, full confiscation of the assets as a legitimate countermeasure according to the international law and as backing of future reparations. And it's important to understand that we should not stop on this. This decision of G7 and decision of the EU is not an alternative to confiscation at all. Actually, frankly speaking, it's not about confiscation at all. It's another story. It's a great story. It's a huge breakthrough, but it's another story. It's about financial aid. It's about gathering efforts and helping Ukraine to survive. But confiscation of assets should also be on the agenda and should be like point one for everybody. Of course, we understand that a lot of states, especially the European Union, have doubts of political, economical, and even legal kind. Although the greatest international legal scholars, one of them is presenting here now, one of the co-authors of this memo, they made great arguments about the legitimacy of the confiscation as a countermeasure, about its legitimacy in case it's not a judicial decision, but as a non-judicial executive measure. And also a lot of analytics has been prepared to show that those fears of European states, of other Western states about the possible risks, economic risks, about the legal risks, risks of adjudication in international courts and tribunals by Russia in case its assets are confiscated, these risks are overestimated. And they are not, these risks are not really so high as it can may seem. So we should further go with confiscation in parallel with deciding on how to use correctly these funds and this aid which is finally granted to us. I'm not underestimating it. It's a great help, it's a great success, and it's a great breakthrough. But confiscation should also be pursued. And finally, I would also like to thank everybody from the government sector, from the NGO sector, and everybody from the Friends of Ukraine, from the embassies, from the international organizations, which helped so much to Ukraine in these really tough times, and which undertook these really politically and economically hard decisions, which cost some great combating in them. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Andrii. I also believe that this is a great breakthrough, because I remember how in the beginning everyone was just so opposed to any steps towards Russian assets. We now have one question to one of our keynote speakers in Zoom, and unfortunately Addar cannot stay with us for the whole time, so I'm going to ask now this question. Addar, are you with us?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, could you please? Oh, yeah, thank you so much. So the question from our Zoom participant is, what is the US Treasury doing specifically to identify all Russian sovereign assets in the US, not just Russian central bank reserves at the Federal Reserves? He means all financial institutions, including in their correspondent accounts and foreign branches, as required by Section 104 of the Ukrainians Act. And thank you for addressing to this group.
Thanks for the question. Let me start by saying, under existing U.S. law called Directive 4, U.S. financial institutions already have an obligation to report all of their Russian sovereign assets, including Russian sovereign assets that are included in correspondent accounts of foreign financial institutions. So we have reporting that's already coming in on this issue. What the Repo Act did was it slightly expanded the definition of Russian sovereign assets. And so what we're doing is we're in communication with all U.S. financial institutions that are subject to this obligation, and making sure that they understand that they need to report all Russian sovereign assets as defined in Repo Act and also as defined in Directive 4. And we expect to have any additional reporting over the course of the next month or two, which will be helpful. But I will say, I do believe we have a good sense now of what Russian sovereign assets we have in the US, thanks to the work of the US Treasury Department, but also our cooperation with international partners. We have a pretty good sense of where the assets are.
Thank you very much. If anyone in the audience wants to address the keynote speakers, so please, now it's the time. Lena.
Hello, thank you very much. I would like to congratulate everybody for this result. And thank you to everybody who spent months doing this. My name is Elena Osmolovska. I represent the Secretariat of Multi-Donor Coordination Platform. And my question relates to the future management of this facility, if we can say so. Do you expect that there will be some common structure on how Ukraine will be using this fund, who will be making decisions or where the funds are going? I have seen that Canada has announced that they will be contributing $5 billion to this facility, but it's still not very clear if there will be one decision-making center or if every contributor will have a say on where the money is going to flow. And the second question is whether there will be some conditionalities attached to this money, and if every contributor will have a different set of conditionalities. Thank you.
Ada, maybe
Thanks
it's for you. Yeah.
Is that question for me?
Yes, please.
Thanks for the question. The honest answer to your question is we're still very much working out the details. So nothing is final. But I think the pieces we're trying to balance is moving quickly with preserving flexibility. So you could imagine that there's a sort of chapeau agreement among everyone participating in the loan on certain key governance and conditionality requirements, sort of foundational requirements. But then in terms of the channel of disbursement, there could be flexibility for different jurisdictions to channel their assets through different vehicles, which would allow, for example, some countries have restrictions on whether funding can go to military purposes, others do not. So we want to make sure that there's as much flexibility as possible from Ukraine's perspective, while still making sure there are certain sort of foundational key principles that are agreed to by every country participating.
Thank you very much for answering that. And I guess that I don't have any more questions from Zoom, so I guess that we can go to our panelists and continue the discussion. And today, unfortunately, Irina Mudra is occupied with the other very important business, and we have the Deputy Director for International Cooperation and Representation Department in the Ministry of Justice, Mykola Yurlov, and Mykola is actually the person who is very much responsible for all the work that is going on around Russian assets. We also have on the panel online, guys, please confirm if we have Vladyslav Rashkovan, who is the Alternative Executive Director for Ukraine at the International Monetary Fund. We have here with us Roman Sulzhyk. Roman, it's very nice to see you here. Roman is one of the supervisory board members at our institution Center for Economic Strategy, but also he is a very well-known financier working in a lot of financial companies globally, and the member of the Supervisory Board of Privatbank in 2019-2022. We have in the panel Yuliya Ziskina. She's a senior legal fellow of the Razom for Ukraine, which is really brilliant advocacy and legal efforts to support the Russian assets confiscation. And we have also online Bohdan Karnaukh with us, who is the analyst for the Organization Institute of Legislative Ideas, also a Ukrainian lawyer, working a lot on the issue of the Russian assets confiscation. And I would like to start with Mykola. So my question to you would be, does the G7 decision, which we are now discussing, truly bring us closer to the full confiscation of Russian assets, or this is just a good intermediate step?
Thank you. Well, as has been discussed here, we are indeed grateful for this step. It has been a far cry from what we have seen for the past 2 years, and let alone speaking of 2014, when the war began over 10 years ago. So we believe we are moving in the right direction, and this is an important step forward to the full confiscation, but it falls short for now of the full confiscation. And we appreciate the efforts of our partners, both on the international level, and Addar specifically was spearheading the campaign for this from behalf on behalf of the US Department of the Treasury. We had a lot of partners in the NGO sector. We can't name them all, there's just too many of them. But this elephant is really very, very big to digest, so we are taking it one step at a time. The most important takeaway here is that this is not about compensation yet. ERA loans are about immediate emergency funding to close the financing gap that we have right now to sustain our war effort, to sustain our existence, to allow us to survive. But this decision does not touch the biggest question, which is the compensation for the damage. And I would like to bring the official data from the World Bank report, the RDNA3, which is capped at the end of 2023. The total losses were estimated at $499 billion US, which is already much more than that because we've seen another campaign of vicious destruction of energy infrastructure all over Ukraine. So even if we take the full amount that is frozen right now, about 300 billion, it won't be enough to make the full compensation, even for the most urgent priorities that we have in funding. But we still believe that this is a good first step.
Yeah, good first step indeed. I would like to pass the floor to Yuliya Ziskina, and my question would be, I know that you were really very much involved into the advocacy and into the work on Russian assets. Are you happy with this decision? Like, is your organization happy with it, or maybe there are some additional details that you might like to highlight before the final construction, final design of this framework is being finalized?
Yes, thank you for this question and for having me here. I do want to echo a lot of what my co-panelists have already said, that this is an interim step, and it's not a substitute for full confiscation. However, 50 billion can sustain Ukraine for the next approximately a year, and I don't need to tell you in this room that that is very, very necessary. But the question still is, what about the assets themselves? At this point, it's my understanding that there's nothing in the agreement that precludes the later transfer of the principal amounts themselves. And supposedly the agreement has been done to make sure that that is the case. But we do need to be watching it carefully because that can change. And a bit of the problem with this proposal is that we haven't really been provided with very many details. So we don't know, for example, the structure, we don't know the conditions, we don't know the terms, or exactly how it will work. So it's my assessment and my understanding that it was announced without political agreement having been reached as to the concrete decisions that need to be taken to make this possible. My worry is that the devil is in the details on this. When the financial guys take, pen to paper and start working this out and structure the deal in such a way, there's the open possibility that it could go in a different direction and it could shut off the future potential to compensate and to confiscate the assets themselves. So our ultimate aim is still must be the principle itself, as everyone here has already said. So I think that's very, very important to keep in mind, and that's why our advocacy can't stop here, and we can't throw our hands up and say, okay, great, we got 50 billion, we made a breakthrough. That's very much not the end of the story. It's, I think, also important in terms of an advocacy sense to make the point clear that this isn't making about Russia pay. That's a lot of the rhetoric surrounding this agreement, but it's fairly duplicitous, I think, because it does very much the opposite of it. It does everything to avoid making Russia pay because it doesn't touch the assets themselves. So I'm not sure about what message this actually sends to dictators like Putin. I would argue it's almost the bit of the opposite. So that's perhaps maybe something we should think about. Again, that's to say it's not that this isn't a major breakthrough, because I think it has fired up and been an important catalyst for these conversations, where very much before this wasn't even on the table. Even a few months ago, the windfall profits of $3 billion a year was unthinkable. So we are moving in the right direction, but it's important to still keep our eyes on the ultimate goal and on the nuance that will entail.
Thank you, Yuliya. And I don't know if the next speaker I would like to invite is Roman Sulzhyk. Do you agree with Yuliya that this is rather not making Russia pay than the opposite? I know that you are a very passionate one about this. And the second part of this question would be, could you please let us know your assessment of how this event might impact the financial markets?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so in short, it's not going to affect the financial markets in any shape or form. And this, even if we confiscated 300 billion today, it will not affect the financial markets in any shape or form. Basically, I spent 20 years in Wall Street, JP Morgan, Deutsche Bank, and I traded $1 billion here, $1 billion there. This 300 billion, the event already happened in the first week after it got frozen. That was the financial market event. So if somebody wanted to move money out of America or Europe, like China or Iraq or whatever, they had 2 years to do so. They don't need to wait for the Russian assets to be confiscated. And this is what people are saying, this is absolutely wrong when the ECB said, oh, you could move the market. If you have this 300 billion assets and you say to JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs, say, give me a bid for this 300 billion of Russian assets, they will give you a 297 billion bid. They will transfer the cash to you, and then they will hedge it immediately, and then they will take 6 months or a year or 2 years to work it into the market. Like basically disposing of these assets and actually confiscating them will have absolutely zero financial impact on the market. But I actually, I completely agree with what you said. This is not making Russia pay, and I'll maybe talk about making Russia pay later in the panel. But I actually personally, I'm not a lawyer, but as a finance guy, I'm saying that to me this 50 billion is extremely positive, because it means that Russia will not, these assets will not get unfrozen in any foreseeable future. So even if they collapse the front today, or Trump comes to power and they force us to sign some shameful peace and say we put like some 2,000 Romanian peacekeepers on the border and now it's like, your friends again, they will not be able to unfreeze these assets until the people who gave the 50 billion are actually paid. So this to me means that these assets are going to stay frozen for foreseeable future until they eventually will get confiscated, and we will eventually have these reparations legally confirmed, and we'll start going. So to me, it's a very positive event. I agree it should be more, but I mean, and I hopefully we'll get to talk about this later. I don't think it's just about grabbing this 300 million. It's a billion. It's about finding a way to have Russia pay even now 20, 30, 40, 50 billion a year consistently through tariffs or like surcharges on trade with them, whatever. That would be, to me, if I have a choice, say 10 billion over next 40 years or this 300 billion one time today, I would take 10 billion forever, any day.
Thank you, Roman. And now I would like to go to our online panelists. Please confirm that they are here. Okay, I see. Great. I see Vladyslav Rashkovan. Vlad is the Alternative Executive Director for Ukraine at the International Monetary Fund. And I know, Vlad, that you have been also very active in negotiating this deal and the other things around the frozen Russian assets, despite the maybe sometimes controversial position of the fund itself and of selected representatives of the fund. So my first question to you would be what was there any fund's role in these negotiations, and is the fund actually looking forward the involvement in the next stages?
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting, and thanks for all the panelists. I was taught many years ago that in each panel we should have a conflict. Otherwise, it's not interesting. If everybody says the same things, it's not interesting. So I will try maybe to a little bit to contradict what was said, but as you will understand, it's definitely a complementary stuff, not contradicting. So first is I want to join in thanking, all of our partners for this decision on the G7. And I want to thank specifically the U.S. government, for their economic diplomacy, as others said. I mean, maybe people in Ukraine. I mean, I understand that all of us live in the very difficult circumstances, but you don't understand that even a week ago, before the G7 decision, there was no decision yet. And this decision was, factually made in the last days. It was prepared for many months. Let's be very frank. Our foreign partners, they are not so brave, as Ukraine was, and I think they were even a bit shocked themselves when in March they frozen assets and they didn't know what to do after that. It's important. But since then, there was a lot of work, both in order to support the decision, to push forward the decision, and also to contradict or to not to have that decision. And I know that as Ukrainians, we want to have as much as possible and as much as possible today. But as already people said today in the panel, this is a step in the right direction, and this is a super important step, especially in this specific moment, also for the IMF. As you know, Masha, for the IMF, it's important that the IMF program to be financeable, and therefore we work on the concept that next 12 months, after each review, they should be fully financed our financing gap. And this money is super important for this. But I want to go, I will tell you now about IMF, but I wanted to go back a little bit to the question why all of us were waiting for this G7 decision, why it was so important, why G7 decision was important, why it was not enough US decision or EU decision, which by the way were recently taken as well. Because one of the key principles is not only that Russia must pay, and I fully agree with that, but also with that there should be some solidarity. Despite what Roman said, there are still some risks, and there were still some risks, linked with confiscation of assets. And those people who are involved in analysis of those risks and management of these risks, they were definitely trying to weigh the pros and cons of the decisions. But and in order to avoid some sort of the international arbitrage between not only Russia, by the way, but also by China, by Saudi Arabia, by United Arab Emirates, people were seeking for solidarity. So G7 currently is the major economic players in the world, and they showed the solidarity in the decision in order to act further and more in a more brave way in respect of Russian assets. And that's why we needed to have G7 decision now. Because, Masha, as we discussed with you in Brussels recently, let's be very frank, currently we went to June with 7 different tracks on Russian assets, where there was no one position. And let me very fast to highlight them. First, there was the Repo Act in US, which actually gave the possibility for the President Biden to confiscate the Russian assets. The second thing was in the European Union. They took recently another decision, mostly linked to their revenues. They decided not to confiscate the assets. They say they will only use the windfall profits from these assets, and which, as was already said, would bring us maybe only like a 2.5-3 billion euro per year, and which would not definitely be sufficient for us because it would not fit to another main principle of the scale. We need to have money, and Russia must pay, to the scale what Ukraine is needed. The third interesting development was something where Ukraine was pushing, from more or less end of 22-23. This is the international compensation mechanism in Hague, and this is also is pretty well developed, and I would say legally is well developed and organizationally well developed instrument, which currently already works in Hague, but which is separate from EU and the US decision. There is the fourth track. Is the national legislations in different countries, and we know that money are not only in US or in European Union, they're in Canada, and there was some decision in Canada, there are some decisions in UK, in Switzerland, in Estonia. So each of these governments, they take the different solutions. Separately, we should mention there is a Belgium, which already also took a decision. As we know, the majority of the Russian assets is in Euroclear. It's around 200 billion euro. And they became already cash, and this is the cash exactly which is invested, which we're currently discussing as revenues from this cash to be further used, to accelerate the proceeds to Ukraine. And we also have the Ukraine. Ukraine has its own path with ARMA on the confiscation of the Russian assets in Ukraine. We already confiscated many of them, and we even already used in 2022 and 2023 budgets in order to also finance the reconstruction. So all of these steps, all of these, they are pretty alternative to each other. They are not complementary, many of them, and therefore the decision of G7, which everybody was looking for, which was seeking, was supposed really to be complementary. That, and I agree with what was already said before, that this step, and this is very much important, that this step is not precluding for the further confiscation, and we need to work on it. IMF was not involved as an institution in decision-making because we have 190 countries, and we need to work on the, to serve, let's say, all membership, not individual countries. Nevertheless, there were some elements where the staff of IMF made very cautious comments. For example, in Belgium FSAP, so the report assessment of the financial sector, in one of the paragraphs they mentioned that there are actions against the Russian assets which would undermine the financial stability in Belgium. And we know that during the recent IMF and World Bank spring meetings, some countries from G20, they were actually blackmailing the European Central Bank, European authorities, that if any actions will be taken, they will withdraw their assets from Euroclear 1, and they will withdraw their investments to the Euro assets as well. And that's why, again, I will go back to the concept of solidarity, because, okay, if they decide to withdraw, where they will withdraw. You have Japan is here, UK is here, US is here, European Union is here together with decisions. So where in Russian rubles, in yuan, so this is will be very difficult for them to move. So I think this would be a bluff rather than action. And I agree here with Roman that this has been done already for a while. But I want to go back to the concept that this decision is super timely, is super important, is sizable. And we don't need to, to undermine saying, okay, it's not enough. I mean, for sure it's not enough. But as of today, this was impossible decision in the current political environment. And I think we can discuss it a little bit later about some technicalities which we may know or may not know, because Addar said the technicalities are currently developed. And I agree, with a colleague from Razom, that the advocacy should continue, especially considering that this summer we will have elections in UK with potential change of government, elections in France. A little bit later, we will have elections in US. Before that, we have elections. We already had elections in Belgium. Belgium will become now the president. Hungary will become the president in European Union. So there will be a lot of the actions which may slow down the technical work, and we definitely need to activate these and to execute, the decision by the year end. And I'm happy later to discuss on the technicalities which are known. Thanks.
Thank you, Vlad, very much. And I want to remind all of the panelists that we will still have some time for the discussion and for the discussion with the floor as well. So I'm asking you to be short and to the point. And with this, I invite to the floor Bohdan Karnaukh. He is an analyst of the organization, the Institute of Legislative Ideas, and Ukrainian lawyer who has been working for already several years on the global Confiscation Tracker. This is the project that aims at the confiscation not only the sovereign assets, but also the corporate assets of different Russian companies and stakeholders and sanctioned people throughout the world. So, Bohdan, how successful was your work, and how do you assess the dynamics on the confiscation of the Russian assets over the past 2 years?
Okay, thank you. I am thrilled to be here on behalf of the Institute of Legislative Ideas, and thank you for presenting our global confiscation tracker. Yes, indeed, we have been running a global confiscation tracker since 2022. So it is an online platform where you can track all the countries, how they change their attitude towards the confiscation of both private and sovereign assets of Russian Federation. So, and this tracker allows us clearly to notice the dynamics in the attitudes of different countries towards the confiscation of Russian assets. And these dynamics are generally positive and indicative. For example, the stance of the US Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen. While a year ago, Ms. Yellen was very cautious about confiscation, pointing out that it involves significant legal risks. She is now calling on partners to consider confiscation. So yes, we do track positive changes. At the same time, it is important to understand what is behind this dynamic. Unfortunately, seizing Russian assets has become not just a matter of punishing the aggressor, but an absolute necessity for Ukraine's survival. It should be done not just because it is the right thing to do, but also because there is no other way to finance defense, budgetary needs, and critical reconstruction. And of course, decision of the G7 to extend a loan at the expense of the profits from Russian frozen assets is a commendable step. And everyone, I believe, in the panel has already stated that the most important thing here is to emphasize that it is not the end of the story. It is just the first chapter. And I believe that the communiqué by G7 allows us to treat it that way, because in the communiqué it says that this measure, extending the loan, is, quote, without prejudice to possible other contributions, end of quote. So I also totally support everyone who has already said today that it does not take other options off the table. So it does not mean that we cannot advocate for confiscation of the principal amount. And although there are some criticism that we've heard both publicly and privately, that this measure, this step could hinder the confiscation of the principal amount, I also hear fully on board with what Andrii said, that the claims by the future creditors could be satisfied from the principal amount if it is confiscated. So it is not a problem. With regard to the private assets, I would say that Ukraine is for sure taking a lead today with our mechanism where the Ministry of Justice files the lawsuits and the High Anti-Corruption Court delivers judgment on not confiscation, it is called the sanction in the form of collecting the assets in the state budget. So with regard to private assets, Ukraine is for sure taking a lead today. we see some legislative amendments in some countries, in particular the Repo Act. In Canada, we have some progressive legislation. In Estonia, recently the law was adopted. But to put it mildly, Western countries are more familiar with more traditional tools such as a non-conviction-based forfeiture, also different fines and sanctions which are imposed on the persons who circumvent the sanctions, and criminal confiscation within criminal proceedings for sanctions evasion. And we believe in the Institute of Legislative Ideas that all these tools could also be used to replenish the fund to support Ukraine. So, for instance, the fines that go for the Office of Foreign Assets Control in the United States.
Do you hear me?
Okay.
Yeah, okay. Just half a minute and wrap up, or?
Yeah, just it was my final statement that there might be some other sources to fund compensation of damage and support Ukraine. For instance, non-conviction-based forfeiture, fines for circumventions of sanctions, and confiscation of the assets subject to confiscation, subject to circumvention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your intervention. And guys, what I want to announce, like we have not that much time from what we've planned initially. That's why I will try to maybe combine the second question to the experts, which was the questions that we have in Zoom. Does it work? Does it? Yeah, it works. With the questions that we have in Zoom, because they very much echo each other. So I actually have part of the Q&A transferred to the panel. And my first question will go to Mykola Yurlov, and unfortunately I don't have the name of the person asking it. What are the main hurdles that need to be overcome in the remaining issues around confiscation, legal, economic, and political? So are there any legal, economic, political reasons that hinder the full asset confiscation?
Well, that's a very complex question, which basically takes the entire panel. But I'll try to, given the lack of time, address each of them in turn. I think that it has already been discussed here today that there is basically no legal impediment to the confiscation. I think you've all seen the memo prepared by world's leading international public law professors, which explain how the countermeasures, the well-established rule of international law, allow for the temporary confiscation of Russian assets. And I mean temporary confiscation. It's somewhat of a counterintuitive term, but the idea is that the assets will be confiscated until Russia agrees to fulfill its international obligation to compensate for the damage. And then they will be returned as a set-off against an outstanding debt. So the scheme is very clear. Russia's already outstanding debt exceeds 500 billion. The G7 countries now seize 300. Then, when the war ends and there is a peace treaty acknowledging the necessity to pay for the compensation, the amount is subtracted. Therefore, this is a reversible countermeasure fully in accordance with international law, exactly as it has been explained by the International Law Commission of the United Nations. So there is no serious legal counter argument. As to the potential cases, litigation or arbitration, as my esteemed colleague Vladyslav has mentioned, we just don't see any possible venue which Russia could turn. It's not like there is an investor-state dispute settlement mechanism, because Russia is not obviously going to be a foreign investor which is protected by a bilateral investment treaty. This mechanism is reserved for investors like corporations. And that's why the seizure of private assets of Russian individuals are much harder, because they are protected by these mechanisms of investor-state dispute settlement. Russia is not. These are sovereign assets. They do not qualify as foreign investment within the meaning of whatever bilateral investment treaty you're talking about. So there is no legal impediment here. economic. I think that's more to my colleagues who have much more experience in that, but I fully share the opinion that if there would have been a risk, it would have materialized when the assets were frozen. And on the contrary, we see reports from the European Central Bank that despite the ongoing debate about confiscation, they have only strengthened their positions as an attractive venue for foreign investments. So we don't see any way how is it going to possible, despite all the blackmail. I think that there is consensus on the panel here as well that where else they're going to go, what other attractive venues for investment they're going to search for, if not these countries. So the main thing, and we understand, is the political fear of action. And I can compare it as sort of an anti-vaccination bias, where you are afraid to take the shot because you're afraid of some sort of a side effect, which you cannot, because it's the fear of taking action. Well, the fear of not taking action here would be the collapse of Ukraine and our defeat in the war, and then potential further encroachment of Russia and continuation of its conquest campaign into the Baltic states, into Georgia, into Moldova, or the Nordic states. We must understand it very clear that we need to compare not one scenario in a vacuum, what if we take the assets, but we also need to factor in our geopolitical calculus, what if we don't take the assets and Ukraine collapses? What is going to happen next? What message, if we talk about messages to dictators, what messages are going to send to those who want to destroy the whole rules-based international order? And this is especially infuriating when I hear that, oh, we don't want to become like Russia. If we seize the asset, it's going to break the international law. This is a blasphemous argument. It's completely ridiculous, because you are allowing the country, the whole campaign of it, of which is aimed at the destruction of international law, to shield behind the rules of international law, which, as we already discussed, allow to confiscate the assets. So that's it in a nutshell, and I would like to, if we have any media representatives here, I would like to invite to take a more deep look at the situation, because very often we see just the parroting of positions of stakeholders like the central bank or the Euroclear that, oh, we don't want to open the Pandora's box, and that's it. The media reporting stops there, whereas there's a lot of very high-level expert analysis which just prove that this position is plainly wrong. So if we have any media representatives here, please follow for contacts. We'll share you all the developed arguments, research, whatever it takes to make a more qualified, a more representative coverage of the issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I want just immediately to pass the floor to Roman Sulzhyk, who can speak of the economic hurdles and economic issues, if there are any. And Roman, also, please, could you outline of what do you believe should be the necessary next steps from the global community?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'll try to liven up this panel of lawyers, because to me, frankly, as an economist, like they're debating like how to confiscate this 300. To me, it's a done deal. Like, I mean, I have zero doubt that, in 5 years in the future is going to be done. I mean, I'm more thinking in terms of, what the sanctions are going to look like 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And if we don't put things in place today that will stay 20, 30 years from now, then we have failed. Because this is all this confiscating 300 billion, confiscating Russian, like whatever, ships or whatever, that's all backward looking. We need forward looking stuff to make sure Russia in 20, 30, 50 years can never threaten anybody again. And basically, this is the premise of the things I want to talk about. Right now, thousands of European companies continue to work in Russia. Thousands, like some thousands left, but thousands continue to work. And they actually, I hear stories there, construction companies going around and saying, oh, please don't mention our name, but we will sell you anything. we'll sell you anything you want. And some of them are actually explicitly going and saying to Russia, we're with you forever. We sold our factories in Ukraine, we're staying with you. And they're like, but what if we confiscate your assets? And they're like, well, then we'll go to Brussels and ask them for compensation, and they will compensate us. I mean, this is ridiculous that in 2025, people are still allowed to go around and say these things. And, you know, so basically, I think that there should be like multi-pronged approach. Like, for example, tax all trade with Russia, 10% tax, you know, it's 10, 20, $30 billion a year, goes to this Ukraine reconstruction fund, reparations facility, whatever you want to call it. And there was a very good question from the audience. Who's going to control these assets? Who's going to distribute these assets? Because if you give them to Ukraine, there's obviously the agency problem that you all know about. You know, because the first time somebody steals 500 million from this 50 billion, you know, the people are going to be, oh, Ukraine is corrupt. You know, we shouldn't give them any more money. You know, so this is why I think all of this money should go to a European or G7 administered fund that gives contracts directly to European, American, Japanese companies to do work in Ukraine. So we basically make a request. We need the railroad, we need a hospital, we need a highway, we need a school, and these guys come in and build it. Because if, for example, Financial Times publishes an article, Ukrainians stole 500 million from the fund, it's a Ukraine problem. If Financial Times publishes an article, Greek company, you know, siphoned 500 million while rebuilding a port in Odessa, is this a Ukraine problem? Sure.
We already have the mechanism, this international compensation mechanism. It was voted by the UN General Assembly. 94 countries supported it. Consists of 3 elements. The register of damage has been launched this year in The Hague. There's the claims commission, which is being negotiated right now by us. And then there's the compensation fund, which is particularly mentioned in the Repo Act, by the way. So there's no need to create anything. It's already been, the infrastructure is set out there. We just need the decision to transfer the money, as the Repo Act provides, to the compensation fund, which will then be paid as compensation to the government, to the individuals, and to the companies. There are 40 categories of claims, including Ukrainian and foreign citizens and companies who have lost anything in related to the full-scale aggression. And that's the transparent international mechanism that is out there. No need to create anything new.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but what I'm basically saying right now, the money that will go towards Ukraine to reconstruction, are you sure that it won't go, like the contracts will go to European companies, or are they go to people like who are friends of people in the government? This is the agency problem that I'm talking about. Like this, basically, I'd much rather see the compensation given, because right now we're working on trying to get Western capital in here, and you saw BlackRock, JP Morgan going around saying, we're going to build this Ukraine reconstruction facility. How much money BlackRock and JP Morgan invested in Ukraine to date? Anybody knows? 0, right? So you can, a good guess, you know, it's a correct guess, right? So basically, and this is what we're seeing as well. Everybody's saying, yeah, we will be able to combat after the war. Right now, in order to get private money to come to Ukraine, we need to have basically them be given procurement by Western companies. And now, I'll finish very quickly. There's a lot of ideas. I wrote a very good, well, I don't want to say very good. I wrote an op-ed to Kyiv Independent. Thanks, Dominic. So if anybody's interested, can look it up. I mean, where I throw out these ideas. But basically, this is what Razom is also working on. Great idea, mandatory disclosure of Russia exposure, where all publicly traded companies that have access to capital in the West, to markets in London and New York, these companies should report to their investors how much taxes they continue paying in Russia, how much business they do in Russia, what do they own in Russia, so investors can make a decision. Do they want to actually continue investing in these companies? And once you have this data, it's very easy to say that if you're paying $1 billion in taxes in Russia in 2025, you have to pay 500 million to the reparations fund or reconstruction fund, whatever, money from which goes to Western companies to actually help rebuild Ukraine. Anyway, I'll stop here, but you can see the gist of the ideas and the passion. Thank you very much.
That's great that you are so passionate, and I really love when there is a dialogue between the panelists, which I believe is very valuable during these discussions because it makes it super lively. And I know that there is another thing. I know that Andrii wants to also enter the dialogue to some point. And Andrii, could you tell us, I know that you see some risks to the confiscation, right? So could you tell us which are these risks not mentioned here?
I would like just to continue the thought that Mykola just talked about, the adjudication of possible confiscation. Actually, it's currently the main barrier and the main problem in the dialogue with the Western officials about the possibility of confiscation, because they say, okay, and what if we draft the laws, what we draft the EU regulations, and after that Russia or Russian Central Bank goes to the courts, international court and national courts, and successfully challenges it, and we have to return this money back and even pay interest, and we don't already have it because we have rule of law, we must abide with it, and so on. But actually, for instance, the International Center of Ukrainian Victory, which I'm representing here, and other organizations, they have made deep and comprehensive studies on this issue based on the case law, based on the court practice, and it showed that at least in international courts and tribunals, either Russia or the Russian Central Bank, they have no chances to win. They have very slight chances to be even found admissible as a party to the procedure. And even if they are found admissible, we had some precedents, for example, in international investment tribunals. It's very doubtful that they may have any success in merits because the case law shows that all courts and tribunals, they abide with confiscation as a non-compensable measures. They abide with and they recognize the use of the countermeasures. They know what is countermeasure and which components does it have, and possible confiscation completely complies with them. And finally, all the international courts and tribunals, they look at this at the international law in the whole entirety. For example, international investment tribunals, they will not look at just violation of Russian Central Bank's rights as an investor. They will look in whole picture, in genocide, in aggression, in killings of the civil population, and they will take it all into account. So in international courts and tribunals, believe me, there are no chances. In national courts, it's doubtful, but also I just would like to believe me, maybe later we can all share, disseminate our studies. The chances are not so high at all. So thank you very much for this.
Thank you, Andrii. And two last questions to two panelists. First of them will go to Yuliya. Yuliya, how do you think? What should be the next steps taken by Ukraine and the international community?
So I will speak in terms of advocacy, since that's my primary role. In terms of advocacy and what I believe might be effective going forward and how we communicate, and I come from this from a perspective of speaking a lot with Western partners, especially in the US. So we talk a lot about these frozen assets being a benefit to Ukraine, how this will help Ukraine, which is absolutely true, but I want to perhaps propose a slight more emphasis on that this decision concerns not just Ukraine, but the international community itself. And when we speak to our partners, that is very much what we should emphasize. So it's not just about, not only about Ukrainian victory, because Ukrainian victory means democracy for all of us. This message really resonates, especially in the US, and it might seem very obvious to all of us in this room, but unfortunately it's not very obvious to many people who aren't well versed on this subject. So that's maybe something to keep in mind when you speak about this. That's also an important role for civil society members here, because civil society plays an important role in education, and as does media. Another key point, I think, moving forward is, as at the beginning, as my US Treasury colleague mentioned, is disclosure of the location and the types of the assets. So far, the Repo Act is the only piece of legislation that actually addresses this. And this is such a key step moving forward, because it's really the first groundwork. It allows us to know how much there is, and therefore how much is available to Ukraine. Another important part of that, as the US colleague mentioned, is that we often say, well, 200 billion of this is in Euroclear. That's only half the story. Actually, Euroclear correspondent banks that operate in the US and the UK and other non-Euro jurisdictions, that is money that can be tapped for Ukraine. It falls under the jurisdiction of those countries. So the breakdown is actually 67% in Euroclear and 37% in non-Euro denominated currencies. So, I mean, it's held by Euroclear, but is still accessible. Another point I want to echo is what my colleague Mykola said, is we hear so many of these counter arguments, and they become circulated among the mainstream over and over and over again until it becomes a refrain in everyone's minds, and that is a huge problem. So we need to make our counter arguments, and we need to make the facts just as commonly understood knowledge as these risks that we keep hearing. So that's an important role that civil society and media can also play. I also want to emphasize that we often hear that, well, confiscation is just the US view because the US view has the repo. That's also not true. There are other institutions in other countries that have legislated for this. Estonia, Canada, the Swiss Parliament, the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. It's not just the American view. There is growing consensus in the international community. So in the end, I do want to emphasize again that the political message has to be the same as it's always been. It needs to be simple and it needs to be clear that 50 billion is a very important step in the right direction. It's a breakthrough. I'm not trying to undermine that in any way. I'm just calling for a little bit more nuance and to not distract from the overall goal. And that overall goal is that the full confiscation of the 300 billion is ultimately what will bring justice to Ukraine.
Thank you, Yuliya. Thank you very much. And I think we will close the panel now with Vlad Rashkovan and go to the questions from the audience just in several minutes. And to Vlad, actually, I don't know, I was choosing, but I cannot choose because I want to ask you about the technicalities and the devil of in the details, which I'm sure you are aware of. But also, I would like to hear your position on the international negotiations and the very concrete next diplomatic steps that would be necessary for Ukraine to make. So I leave you with this choice, and please, the floor is yours. Please be short.
Well, thanks. Apparently, they are interconnected, these two topics, because, as I mentioned, the geopolitical situation is not super nice, and therefore we will have to maneuver between, different political issues this year, both in Europe and in US. But I think Natalia Yareska was asking about the specific technicalities and what would be the next steps. The next step is to agree on technicalities, and this is still will require a lot of economic diplomacy. Let's try to highlight what we may know today and what is still a question mark for us. So first, what will be the jurisdiction of this future decision? Because as we understand, G7 decision is a political decision. We need to operationalize it. So what will be the jurisdiction of the decision? I believe that it will be run under the EU legislation because the majority of assets is still in the European Union, but I think this to be still checked. Who will be loan beneficiary of the money from this 50 billion, as we speak about now? It will be the beneficiary will be government of Ukraine, but it's important, and Natalia was asking that, for Ukraine, this will be considered as a contingent liability, because rather than a loan. Why? Because we don't repay interest on this loan. We even don't need to repay this loan only upon a condition when we will receive full access on Russian assets or we will receive access to reparations or something which was discussed between the G7 leaders, the peaceful peace settlements. So the amount, you should be aware that there was a discussion about from 30 to 75 billion when more or less Europe was already ready politically to take the decision. They wanted to decrease the amount from 50 to 30. And I think it was very successful that we kept it in 50. And how we came to 50, this was more or less analysis how much money we need 2024, 2025 in order to address our, at least the budgetary and some part of the military needs. So the tenor, I think the tenor for this loan will be, up to 30 years, but this is already a part of the financial engineering. I think the tenor will depend on the interest, on the and the yields on these assets, where they will be financed, they will be invested. Sorry with that. Who are the lenders? I think US was ready to do the lending itself. But it is very good that Canada, UK, and Japan also said that they are ready to join this loan to Ukraine. In terms of purpose, and this is to the comments of Roman, the first purpose is still a budgetary, to support the budget. Second is military, and reconstruction is later. So it's not super focused now on the reconstruction, but Addar said, from US Treasury, said that not all countries agree on financing the war element. And that's why when I speak about disbursement agents, the G7 communique says that there will be different channels. I think US was planning to use the Federal Financing Bank of Treasury. Also, World Bank Trust Fund may be considered, even IMF administrative account can be also considered as channels to provide money to Ukraine, or they could be developed some special purpose vehicle, SPV, to do that. This will be still discussed, and the decision is not there. In terms of interest rate on the loan, I think it's irrelevant for us. We are not repaying it, but it will be definitely floating and linked somehow to the EU depo rates in Europe. Source of repayments of the loan. Again, we are not repaying today. Those who will provide the loans, they need to be repaid according to some interest and agreement. And it's important because I think somebody said on the panel that the loan is collateralized with Russian assets. It's not collateralized with Russian assets. It's collateralized now with the future revenues. And therefore, the windfall revenues themselves, not assets, will be a source for repaying the loan. Collateral, as I said, collateral says also revenues, not assets, and revenues not only in EU, as was said, there are only 67% of assets in EU, but also in Japan, UK, US, and other countries. So what other political decisions will be still needed? My understanding is still will be under discussion on the guarantees. The guarantees, there should be at least 3 types of guarantees, maybe more. First is that the countries which keep assets, that they will keep them, let's say, untouched and not returned to Russia. And this may contradict to some of our intentions, but just to give you understanding that if we confiscate assets tomorrow, so it means that we need to repay the loan. We cannot keep the loan and confiscate assets together. Second guarantee will be that those who get revenues from Russian assets or from cash from Russian assets, they will be directing these revenues to repay the loan to those who will provide the loan. Again, it's not so easy because the majority of assets in Europe, Europe is not providing the loan. So it means that Europe should repay this money to US. And this was one of the major obstacles in all these political discussions. And also from Ukraine also should give some sort of guarantee that in case we receive money from reparations or these peaceful settlements, that we will use this money for repayment of the loan. We need also, there are risks, still a lot of risk, and everybody will try to build some sort of backstop in case some maybe international court decisions will say, nasty decisions will say that this may be unlawful. It's important who pays to whom and how to contribute to some sort of the pool of the risk, some sort of the pool of money to manage that risk. As a necessary step, clearly there will be, in order to strengthen those commitments to keep assets untouched, there will be needed some potential legislation actions, including in Belgium. It could be either the law of the parliament or the royal decree, because one of the major risks which those who provide loans consider are linked with the fact that the freezing of the Russian assets is linked with EU sanctions. And if the sanctions wane, so factually potentially the freezing also can wane. So there is an important element to ensure that those assets will not be repaid, even if one day the EU sanctions will wane. In terms of conditionalities, I think somebody was asking if there are any conditionalities. Ukrainian authorities were asking, and the Minister of Finance was saying this recently in an interview, that there will be no linked conditionalities to that. And I believe we will see these in the next months. And the last thing, maybe when we may receive the first money, you know that the European assets, they were somehow already. There were some decisions on bringing 90% of these year revenues, to the peace fund in Europe, which should be spent money for military and 10% for reconstruction. So I think that our target is to take all necessary decisions by US elections, meaning by end of the year, and to have the disbursements from 2025. This is what is known today, more or less, from the discussions, public, non-public, but still, as you see, there are a lot of technicalities which need to be closed, and these will be spent a lot of economic diplomacy and a lot of capital in the next months in a difficult, geopolitical circumstances. So the path will be not so easy. It's not like a forest journey. Thanks.
Sounds like truth. Thank you very much, and I want to thank all of our panelists. We have a number of questions, a lot of which has been already addressed by one or the other speaker, but I know that we are well late in terms of time, so that's why I want to address to the audience if anyone wants to ask the question or make a statement, and please introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Stephen Moore. I'm the founder of the Ukraine Freedom Project, and I learned most of what I know about this stuff from Yuliya, and so and here's what we're doing is we had put together a public education campaign that helped persuade Speaker Johnson to pass the Aid to Ukraine bill, and we're doing a smaller but similar campaign to keep the public focused on implementing repo in the United States. And in thinking about internationally, like, who are the 5 people in the world who need to say yes to get these assets confiscated?
Vlad, could you take this, or any? Mykola? Okay, Vlad.
I think those 7 people who were supposed to say, they said already it's yes, and believe me, as I said, even in the last weeks, there was a lot of discussions on the level of President. President himself was doing a great advocating job, both with President Macron, with President Scholz, with Chancellor Scholz, and others. So he's well informed and well, briefed on the different topics on that. This will be now the topic will go back to the Ministries of Finance. So we need to look at the EU, colleagues, because they believe that they are somehow let's use this word, maybe overplayed. And it's not a political statement, but because the majority of money there, and they are not even providing the loan. So therefore, it's both ECB, so Christine Lagarde, but also with ECOFIN in general, and the leadership of ECOFIN, so European Ministers of Finance. They will be needed. The second person would be probably the king in Belgium, to take that decision, the royal decree. The 3 is the guys who will really work on a technical level. We don't need to convince Dalip Singh, but we need to understand, and I don't know those names, who are the technical people who are discussing with him that specific issue. And we probably need to convince also the World Bank somehow, because the majority of money most probably will go through the World Bank. World Bank was used very well in order to route the U.S. money, U.S. grants to Ukraine. But now when this is linked with more or less the issue which is not in their jurisdiction, which is Russian assets, etc., they may be not super refined, because for us, World Bank is absolutely okay-ish instrument. We understand this kind of channel venue. There is already mechanism working between the Ministry of Finance and others. So these would be my my names. Maybe I missed someone.
Thank you, Mykola. Maybe.
Yeah, I just want to add, like Vlad, you see, and this is you get a feel for what it's like to be in Europe when he started thinking about all the people, and then ended with the king.
Yeah, I've never tried to lobby a king before.
Yeah, no, but really, like what this is, and this is what I'm pushing for, is we need to basically convince the business that it's never going to be a return to business as usual with Russia, because there's a massive amount of lobbying by business right now not to confiscate these assets. Western, like European business, American businesses are lobbying not to confiscate these assets, because they're saying then Putin will confiscate the rest of our assets. And this is why, we need to actually give business a lifeline, and this is what people are not talking about here. Business has already lost over 100 billion by New York Times estimate in Russia. We need to give all of these businesses a claim for these 100 billion. Like say Coca-Cola, you lost $1 billion. Like here's a claim on Russia for $1 billion, stamped by a judge, but paid only after Ukraine is made whole. So after Ukraine is made whole, 500, 600 billion in reparations, then your 100 billion will come in. So what will Coca-Cola do immediately? If they get this billion claim, maybe receivable after 30 years, they will sell it to a hedge fund for $200 million in cash right now. And the hedge fund, once it gets this $1 billion claim on Russia, it will never let Russia go. Never. Even in 50 years, the Russia will still be paying, right? So your answer is, like, convince the CEO of Pepsi Cola, who still continues to work in Russia, convince the CEOs of all the companies that continue to do business in Russia to get out of Russia, and that's when all these assets will get confiscated.
Love it. Thanks.
Yeah, I know that this was a very interesting question for all of our panelists, so please, who else wants to comment? First Mykola, then Andrii.
I'll just briefly add, it's very hard to boil it down to 5 particular individuals, because as far as we're concerned, the foreign policy decision-making in G7 countries is a rather complicated process, and for each jurisdiction you need a targeted advocacy and diplomacy campaign, which includes a lot of stakeholders, which include both the leaders, the financiers, the business, the big business, and what's very important, the parliamentarians. I think this is a very important category of target audience that we are already engaging in many of those countries, and this, we believe, is the most promising target audience, because we can give them a very clear idea that as of now, the money is going to be paid by their taxpayers. Why? If they have the Russian money that can be used for that instead. I think this is a very clear message that could be used to promote this idea. Why are you making yourselves pay for the damage caused by Russia? If there is Russian assets lying right there, you don't have to go anywhere to take them. Just take them and transfer them to the compensation mechanism.
And I just wanted to jump in and to supplement the Roman's argument about convincing business. It's very important for them to understand that measures applied by Russia against Western business acting on Russian market, they are not related to confiscation of Russian assets at all. It all began already in 2022, when everybody was fearing even to speak about confiscating Russian assets loud. And already in 2022, Russia began imposing a lot of limitation, a lot of restrictions on foreign business to get over the market, to sell its assets. And a lot of assets have been, actually confiscated by Russia, actually. And there is no connection with the possible confiscation of Russian assets in the West. Of course, I understand that each big company is very optimistic about that. Every company maybe can think, okay, it will not concern me, I can make a separate deal. But I think no, and a lot of people also think no, because Russia and Russian power authorities, they understood that rob Western companies is much more profitable for them than to have business with them, because they buy out them for pennies. They disseminate it within Putin's and other powerful friends, and it's a source of enrichment. So that's why it's important to spread this message that confiscation of Russian assets is not doesn't have any connection to what Russia is doing with Western businesses. So it's necessary for Western businesses to come off the Russian market and stop supporting genocide of Ukrainian people. Thank you.
Yuliya, I just ask you to be short because I want to take like 2 more probably questions and wrap up because we don't have time anymore. So please.
Very, very short. So much of our discussion has been focused on the financial side, the ministry, the ministers of finance, the businesses, but I do want to emphasize that this is not a financial decision. This is a national security decision. It is a policy decision, and it's something that needs to come from that perspective, which is not necessarily something that financial types have, and this is the issue that we're running into. It also takes it out of discussion from the policy sphere and puts it into this sort of inaccessible discussion, but that's not true. This is policy, same as any other means of supporting Ukraine and protecting national security is. So that's what we should be focusing on.
Thank you, Yuliya. Just to comment on several questions that came in Zoom, I think that all the questions on technicalities and details, Vlad has answered as much as he could. I don't know, maybe Mykola can add something if you want, but I think that he was...
We don't know anything in particular yet. We're still waiting for the details.
Yeah, that's actually the answer to a lot of your questions. We are really sorry. We are still waiting for anything to be first agreed and then published, but there are several of them. I would ask probably 1 and maybe 2 questions from the Zoom, and then 1 last question from the audience, and we will wrap up. So please, everyone answering, be really short. Probably Roman or Mykola, I don't know who from you. How is this discussion in particular, the upcoming G7 50 billion loan to Ukraine, related to the ongoing restructuring discussions between Ukraine and its private creditors? How do you see this link? Do you see any, Roman?
Yeah,
please be short.
Yeah, I don't think it's related in any way, but it's definitely makes it more difficult because the creditors are saying, why should we take a haircut if you're getting all this money? But this is also, back to the point of kind of confiscations, unless we normalize the relationships with Western businesses that lost money in Ukraine, because as soon as we confiscate this 300 billion, UCAS will show up and get a decision in some European court saying 50 billion should be transferred to them, right? How do we safeguard these 300 billion from decisions of the likes of UCAS? Is it done? Do you guys have a plan, or is this up? Right, so you're smiling, right? So this is what I'm saying. It's like, this is why by normalizing the relationship between Ukraine and Western businesses that lost money on behalf of Russia, we will actually make sure that we need to align their interests, not be competing for this money.
Thank you, Roman. Last question from Zoom to Mykola Yurlov. It goes, can the supporting countries just agree to enforce the judgment on Ukrainian courts to confiscate Russian assets, to enforce the judgments on confiscation in their own jurisdictions?
A short answer, I believe no. We have specifically created the international compensation mechanism to avoid this rather chaotic attempts. I understand the lawyers that have attempted them, and I commend their efforts, but in order to evade the questions on jurisdictional immunity, particularly raised by the International Courts of Justice decision in Germany versus Italy with Greece intervening, the international compensation mechanism has been launched. So we would advise to focus on that mechanism rather than attempting to enforcing national court decisions.
Thank you very much. Last question from the audience, and we will wrap up. please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Gleb Vishlinsky, CES Director. I have a question, I believe, to Vlad Rashkovan. Speaking about mechanism of using of this like potential 50 billion, what are the ways you mentioned it to use this money for funding military needs of Ukraine if we will have to do it next year? I understand that World Bank is a mechanism that could not be used in this case. Like, what are possible solutions, and will the volume of the solutions be enough if we need to spend significant amount of money on weapons, for example, next year? Thank you.
Thanks, Gleb. There are two elements here. The element number one that, and I think the colleague from the Minister of Justice already said in the beginning, that we don't need to look at this G7 decision in isolated way, because in parallel, there are a few other decisions which are important. For example, the Ukraine is signing now the security guarantees, and all of these security guarantees with different countries, mostly with NATO countries, they are including also the financial support of Ukrainian military. And if you add up all of them, I think we will come up to more or less annual commitment from our NATO partners to provide around 40, 50, 60 billion dollars of additional support for the Ukrainian military sector in the next year. Going back to your specific question, this specific decision on G7 on 50 billion, one of the obstacles for that was exactly that the European Union was saying, look, we already decided to allocate this money to the two different jars. One is for the peace fund, which will finance the military, and part 90%, and part of it will be for the budgetary support and reconstruction. And what you propose today might exclude the military support, because exactly the World Bank cannot finance the military expenditures. That's why the decision of G7 assumes or says that there will be different channels. And which kind of channels, we don't know yet today. So we will find out it soon. It looks like the World Bank is a very good instrument, and as I said, a venue for us. What will be used for the military? I'm not aware today. I don't know this, but I'm sure they will find a way that part of this money will be used, for the military. Which kind of part? How much? This will be, I think, still a discussion.
Thank you very much, Vlad, and thank you very much all of you who came here today. Despite the game, despite the big day, you still chose to speak about the frozen Russian assets rather than watch exciting football. And I want to thank also our partners, International Renaissance Foundation. Their generosity made this event possible, as it made possible a lot of other CES events and projects. My thanks go to our partners, the International Center for Ukrainian Victory, and the two Kiev Independent Insights, who also were preparing this event. Just to close today's meetings, I want to cite again the leaders' communique from the G7 meeting. They agreed that they are to step up collective efforts to disarm and defund Russia's military-industrial complex. So I very much hope that they will also step up efforts to arm and fund Ukraine. And this fear of action will indeed, Mykola, you mentioned it, will turn into the fear of inaction, and the consequences will be good for Ukraine. Thank you so very much. Glory to Ukraine. Help our ZSU. Donate to Leleka Foundation and all the other funds. Thank you.
Thanks to Masha, everybody, for hosting this wonderful event.
Excellent moderation. Thank you.
Everybody, applause.